Welcome back once again to the Imaginary Gallery. This will be version 2.0 regarding narcissistic abuse and addiction. A question that comes up in the book we're discussing, which is Lundy Bancroft's Why Does He Do That? Which I've since done some research, and Lundy happens to be a man, which is surprising. I figured it would be a lady because it's got the male title, but we can't always be right. The next section here, though, partner's abuse does not go away when an addict recovers. Did you get that? And, as we paraphrase, because it's illegal to read directly from a book, over several years, many of this author's clients have gone into recovery from addiction while they're participating in his program. Sometimes because of pressure from the author. No significant improvement occurred as a result, except in those men who also worked seriously on their partner abuse issues. During the first several months of recovery, a man's harsh daily criticism and control sometimes soften, and any physical violence he was using may lessen or cease for a period, raising the hopes of the abused partner. He or she interprets the respite as confirmation that the addiction did indeed cause the abusiveness. His behavior towards her gradually or abruptly reverts to being as destructive as it was while it was drinking or taking drugs or whatever. So our lovely author tells us that, ironically, the man's backsliding tends to begin precisely as his recovery from addiction starts to take solid hold. The early period of recovery is all-consuming. The compulsion to drink is intense. So the alcoholic fights a daily internal battle and is often holding on by a thread. He may be attending one or more substance abuse programs per day, which occupy his time and maintain his focus. One result of this Herculean effort is that the man has little time, energy, or mental space devoted to controlling or manipulating his partner. He's entirely self-focused and absorbed. But when he starts to come out the other end of this, the attention becomes redirected towards the partner, and the desire to bully reemerges. It's not uncommon for abusive people to actually get worse when they're in some kind of recovery program, partly because they may be irritable from not drinking and not taking whatever, and they'll take it out on their family members. Others become more controlling when sober than they were when they were intoxicated, and they stand guard with eyes that are no longer clouded by alcohol. Perhaps even more important is that an abuser's recovery program tends itself to become a weapon to use against its partner. Once he stops drinking, for example, he may turn around and insist that she is the alcoholic in the family. Even if she only drinks a little, he'll start to criticize her for being in denial about her drinking, which is a concept, of course, he has learned at the meetings he goes to, if he's going. Now he feels he's an expert. Insulting comments about her drinking habits and pressure her to give up alcohol and join AA are likely to follow. Now, this is the same thing with therapy or with AA, but the abusive person may use specific concepts from either against the partner. For example, the AA encourages participants to review their own faults and misdeeds and make an inventory of them, and discourages criticizing somebody else's inventory. The abuser turns this concept against the partner so that any time she will go with it for now. Anytime she attempts to complain about his abusive behavior and how it affects her, he'll say, "You should work on your own issues." Similarly, he uses the danger that he might drink as an excuse to control her. For example, when he's bothered by something she does, such as confront him about his bullying, he says, "You're getting me stressed, and you know I might drink if I get under too much stress." The accusation, "You're threatening my sobriety," becomes a new tool that this abuser can use to hammer and silence out the partner. Abusers thus develop new excuses for abuse to make up for the fact that they can no longer say, "Oh, I was drunk, that's what I did." And then Lundy Bancroft states that the philosophy of the 12-step programs includes elements that could be valuable to abusers, but he finds that his clients tend to ignore the principles that could help. For example, according to the the alcoholic has a responsibility to make amends for all the damage he's done to others while he was drinking. Abusers choose instead to take an almost opposite view, arguing that their partners should not raise grievances about past abuse, because that was when I was drinking, and I'm not like that anymore. You should let go of the past. You see, they think that recovery from alcoholism as a gigantic self-awarded amnesty program that should cause their partner's resentments and mistrust to just vanish. Abusers in recovery can be just as committed to blaming their behavior on the alcohol as they were while drinking. They choose to misinterpret the AA philosophy to mean that they were not responsible for their actions while they were drinking, which is not what AA proposes, and that therefore alcohol is a full and adequate explanation for all the cruelty and selfishness to which they've subjected their poor targets. Some of his clients use their recovery to try to escape their responsibilities, saying that they can't help with children, they can't get a job, or contribute in other ways, because the program says, "I need to keep my focus on myself." In this way, recovery can feed an abusive man's, self-centeredness and excuse-making. A woman who hears the abuser express these attitudes may find herself doubting that he is really changing, and her skepticism is well advised. The partner may say, "You just have no faith in people," or "You don't believe anyone can change," as if putting her down were the way to persuade her that he's no longer abusive. But her instincts are correctly telling her that he's very much the same. He also, author states, he's had clients who do make significant changes from a combination of recovery from alcoholism and working seriously on taking responsibility for their abusiveness. Only then does the abuser's recovery from addiction begin to become a significant step. The author's next point is that alcohol has no biological connection to abuse or violence. And Mr. Bancroft says that alcohol does not directly make people belligerent, aggressive, or violent. There is evidence that certain chemicals can cause violent behavior, anabolic steroids, for example, or crack, cocaine. Crack is whack, but alcohol is not among them. In the human body, alcohol is actually a depressant, which is a substance that rarely causes aggression. Marijuana similarly has no biological action connected to abusiveness. I'm going to get you. Alcohol and other substances thus contribute to partner abuse in two ways. Number one, a man's beliefs about the effects of the substance will largely be borne out. If he believes that alcohol can make him aggressive, it will, as research has shown. On the other hand, if he doesn't attribute violence-causing powers to substances, he's unlikely to become aggressive even when severely intoxicated. Number two, alcohol provides an abuser with an excuse to freely act on his desires. After a few drinks, he turns himself loose to be as insulting or intimidating as he feels inclined to be, knowing that the next day he can just say, "How about last night? Huh? I was drunk, huh?" Or even claim to have completely forgotten about the whole thing. And hopefully that'll let the family or the partner let him off the hook. And then Mr. Bancroft says that courts tend to be especially lenient with abusers who blame their violence on a drinking problem. And the alcohol is the excuse that he accepts, so he isn't kept awake at night with gnawing guilt about having hurt his partner. It doesn't say doctor, so I'm guessing he's not a doctor, but the author has had several physically violent clients admit that they made the decision to assault their partners before they had alcohol in their systems. They went out, as a few of them put it, to grease the wheels, drinking for a couple of hours before coming home to start a vicious, scary fight. The alcohol arms the abuser with an excuse and helps him overcome any shame or embarrassment that might hold him back. Beware of the man who believes that drugging or drinking makes him violent. If he thinks it will, he will be right. The next question we come across is, what about the man who is abusive only when he drinks? Now, the author states he can count on one hand the number of clients he's had whose abusiveness is entirely restricted to the times of intoxication. However, he's worked with dozens of men whose worst incidents are accompanied by alcohol use, but whose controlling and disrespectful behaviors are a pattern even when he is sober. These abusers tend to fit into one of the following categories. Number one, the verbally abusive man who escalates to physical violence or threats only when intoxicated. When he asks the partner of such a person to describe his day-to-day behavior, the partner usually reports he gets meaner and scarier when he's drinking, but that the name-calling, disrespect, and selfishness is the same whether he is drunk or sober. She tends to feel that his physically scary behaviors would stop if she could get him into recovery, and that she could manage the rest of his abusive behaviors. This soothing hope is a false one for two reasons. Number one, when this style of abuser gets sober, he gradually accustoms himself to using violence without the assistance of alcohol, usually over a few years. And number two is, even if he is among the small number of exceptions to this rule, the woman usually discovers that his psychological abuse can be as destructive, if not worse, than the physical, which tosses her back into having to figure out what to do. The second example is the verbal abuser who becomes even more cruel and degrading when drinking alcohol, but he doesn't escalate to violence. He's doing the same thing that the physically abusive, assaultive person does, using alcohol as an excuse. If he gets sober, he gradually comes up with new excuses, including learning to use his recovery as an excuse, and life goes on as it always has. And the third one is the assaultive abuser who becomes even worse violently when intoxicated. Author finds this style the most common among substance-addicted partners. When this abuser is not intoxicated, he mostly refrains from the scariest forms of violence, like punching and kicking and threatening to kill. The partner may say, "He's only violent when he drinks," but she then goes on to tell him, the author, that he shoves or grabs her, walks toward her in a menacing way, is sexually rough, or uses other forms of physical intimidation to assault, even when sober. These are behaviors that the abuser has succeeded in convincing her not to define as violence. So Mr. Bancroft says if your partner's behavior becomes much worse when he or she is intoxicated, you may tend to focus your attention on trying to manage the drinking so that you never fully realize how abusive he is when he is sober. The substance abuse problem can thereby create a huge diversion from critical issues. Liquor does not change a person's fundamental value system. People's personalities when intoxicated, even though somewhat altered, will bear some kind of relationship to who they are when sober. When you're drunk, you may behave in ways that are silly or embarrassing. You might be overly familiar or tactlessly honest, or perhaps careless or forgetful. But do you knock over little old ladies for a laugh? Probably not. Do you sexually assault the clerk at the convenience store? Doubtful. People's conduct while intoxicated continues to be governed by their core foundation of beliefs, attitudes. Even though there is some loosening of the structure, alcohol encourages people to let loose what they've been simmering below the surface.
Another thing I did was my classic trick, projection. When I started to realize that you were probably starting to realize that I might be only using you for something, I had to beat you to the punch. So do you recall?
That one night that I said to you, sometimes I get the feeling that you're just using me. Which was classic projection because, hello, I'm using you for your bank account and your house, but I did that on purpose because it was like an insurance policy. It wouldn't be long before you realized that I was the one using you. So I set that up in advance, so if by chance you caught on and said something about you think I'm using you, well, honey, I would just say, "Oh, you silly, you're copying what I said to you." See how that works? which would of course fill you up with self-doubt, which was the intention. I had to beat you to the punch, and it worked. So many of my techniques work because they're tried and true. It's just another person, same story, different character. Welcome to my life. I am the Narcissistic.
My private parts are on fire.